This week, we're putting Major League Rugby's best ball carriers under the spotlight. On today's episode, we find out how ball carry meter stats reshapes fantasy rugby in the MLR. The Fantasy Ruckers show starts right now.
Where rugby and the world of fantasy sports collide. Welcome to the Fantasy Ruckers show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, talking all things rugby from the MLR to leagues around the world. We're on top of it. Headphones on, pads off. This is the Fantasy Ruckers show. Now, here are your hosts, Ryan Yee, Matt Yee, and Devin Vanderpool.
What's up, everybody? This is episode number 36 of the Fantasy Ruckers show. Thank you so much to our Fantasy Ruckers League members, our community members, and everyone else tagging along on this journey of trying to make fantasy rugby a reality in the MLR. Matt Yee, Devin Vanderpool, Ryan Yee here with you to talk a little bit about fantasy rugby stats. Guys, we said it at the top of the show, we're highlighting some of the Major League Rugby's best ball carriers on this episode. Gonna be a good one. You guys said, hey, last episode, you guys asked for, you said, hey, we want some ball carry meters on this upcoming in-depth stats deep dive.
That's
and
right.
just because I'm just such a good commissioner of the best fantasy rugby league in the entire world here, I'm going to give you what you guys asked for.
Hey, look, last episode, we tackled the stats. This episode, we're running the stats, baby. That's what's going on.
How long did it make you to come up with that?
I thought about that all morning, boys.
Matt chose violence this morning.
There we go. But yeah, we're going to talk about ball carry meters today. We're going to see how that has an impact on the world of fantasy rugby. We're going to integrate it into the 2022 stats, see how that affected the player rankings there in 2022. And then we'll see whether or not it's something that Matt Yee and Devin Vanderpool like, and whether or not there'll be something they'll want to implement going forward in the fantasy rugby world. I have a feeling it is going to be something that that they are going to be excited for, but we're going to break it all down. But before we get there, if you haven't yet, make sure you're following us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. If you want to be first in the know about fantasy rugby in the MLR, if there's a league that opens up, more information, anything that has to do with fantasy rugby in Major League Rugby, you will want to follow us there, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook. We also got a Discord channel. The link to join that is in the description. A great community of people to talk a little bit of fantasy rugby and more, just kind of great rugby content over there. So you'll want to join that community as well. That's where we'll keep everyone up to date when it comes to the Fantasy Ruckers League and when we try to expand this thing. And hey, you'd also give us a like, subscribe to our YouTube channel as well. There's a video portion if you'd like to see Matt and Devin's beautiful faces in addition to the podcast, version of this episode. We got a video version on YouTube as well. So now that we got that out of the way, guys, let's hop into some news and notes here. I feel like we got a lot to catch up on. A flurry of roster moves here in the past week. It feels like there's just been a whole bunch of roster movement. It might be in the off season, but it seems like teams are still forever and constantly changing here with their rosters. So how I'm going to do this, because there's so many, guys, I'm going to break them all down, or I'm going to announce them to you guys. And Matt, I'm going to start with you. You're going to tell me what's good here, and you're going to tell me which of these actually matter when it comes to fantasy rugby. So let's break it all down. Let's tell you who's going where, and then we'll talk a little bit about it. Hey, Vandy, your boy's making some moves, some big roster moves here. The Utah Warriors signed fly half Joel Hodgson to a multi-year contract. The team announced this week. It's going to be interesting. The now new Utah Warriors member joins with after having 110 appearances in Premiership rugby in England with the Newcastle Falcons. So a lot of professional rugby experience. So it's going to be interesting there. A very recent signing as well, at least at the time of this recording, the Toronto Arrows have landed Australian winger Fabian Goodall to their list, and they've also added Micaiah Torrance-Reid from the Manawatu, I believe, Turbos over there. He's coming over to the Toronto Arrows as well. Cole Davis is moving from Rugby Atlanta to the Toronto Arrows. The Arrows seemingly making a whole bunch of moves there. Adrian Wadden from the Arrows is going overseas to play Sandy Bay RFC. Old Glory DC has re-signed Danny Tusitala. Josh Larson returns to the New England Free Jacks, and Rodney Iona goes to Nola Gold from the Brumbies. Oh, I think I'm out of breath there, but a whole bunch of roster moves to say the least. But here, Matt, I'll start with you, man. Break this all down for us. What does this mean for fantasy rugby? Which of these moves is actually going to have an impact for fantasy managers heading into this next season?
Hey, there is one move that I saw that I think is going to make a massive impact. And, you know, Vandy, I'll give it to you. You know, you were telling us, you warned us like a month ago. You went on a bit of a sabbatical after that, but you warned us 2 months ago. You said, hey, Utah's making a big pickup.
That's right.
And that's the pickup that I want to talk about that's going to have the most fantasy impact. I mean, we're talking about a guy who has 110 appearances in the Premiership, goes over, plays for Glasgow as well. I mean, you don't get 110 appearances in one of the top leagues in the Northern Hemisphere just by getting by. I mean, this guy is going to come in. He's going to be a veteran presence, and he's going to put up some points and going to be somebody that I think is going to quickly rise in the draft stocks and one of those rookies that is going to be definitely be on most of the team's radar.
Now, what do you think? How do you think he works with McEnany?
That's what I was just going to say.
Yeah, I mean, McEnany for me is a 15. I think that's where at fullback. Yeah. I think that's where he's comfortable.
He can play wing too, so
yeah. But I mean, the fact that he has the ability to also be a playmaker, also be a ball handler, you're going to want to put him in. I'm going to assume that the Warriors are going to put him at 15.
It sounds like fullback for sure.
And I mean, look, as much as we want to say it, nothing is confirmed right now. Caleb McEnany's playing down in the NPC. You know, if he plays well enough, maybe he gets a tryout for a Super Rugby side. We don't know. Maybe this is one of the ways that Utah is kind of securing somebody in that key role to make sure that they have somebody there that they can say, hey, this guy's riding with us for 2023.
Because did Cliven Laubser, did he play any 10? Because I know he'll be away with his like he's on another team. I can't remember what team it is.
Let me see. I don't believe so. I can pull up that stat for you right here. Cliven Laubser, he played fly half to start the season for 2 weeks, and then he made an appearance towards the end with about 5 weeks remaining at the fly half position, but not really a staple. You're right, Vandy. It was mostly McEnany for a large portion of the season at that fly half position. Matt, before you move on to kind of the next roster move here, just to put things into perspective, McEnany last season, at least under our 2022 Fantasy Ruckers League rules, was able to tally a total of 57.4 total fantasy points, finished 20th on the season, also had the kicking duties for Utah as well, so was definitely a staple player when it comes to fantasy MLR, at least for our season in our inaugural year. We'll see how that changes when we integrate some of these stats that we'll be talking about shortly here, but at least last year McEnany was a significant part of the fantasy landscape, at least in that 2022 year. So we'll see how the impact that all shakes out with the signing of Joel Hodgson, who, like you mentioned, Matt, has a whole bunch of professional experience. I can only imagine that they're going to try to slot him there with that experience, because that's exactly what you want at the 10 position.
Yeah, so. And I mean, similarly to that, just to quickly touch on that, is also the Nola Gold signing of Rodney Iona. I mean, Samoan international, you're bringing in somebody, if you're going to bring in an international player, an experienced international player to come play for your side, you want it to be in one of those key positions like fly half, like the first five. You want to be a guy playing in that position, because those guys are going to steer the ship with their experience. And then the last thing I just want to touch on is, hey, the Arrows are making moves. They're making moves in their back line, lots of moves in their back line, some moves in their forward pack. But they're stacking up on some big wingers. Cole Davis and Fabian, I forget his last name, but I'm just going to call him Fabian.
Fabian Goodall.
Some big boys. I mean, I think he's like 233 or something like that. So,
255.
255. I was even
255.
So look, I mean, let's watch out for the Arrows. They clearly are using their international spots well.
We gave them one. You're welcome.
So let's definitely see how they do. I think that'll be somebody that we'll probably be picking up by the end of the season.
I do like, though, Matt, how you mentioned the fly halves first there, because I think there is a little bit more clarity in terms of fantasy impact that we can kind of foresee with those players more so than, let's say, the wingers that Toronto Arrows are signing. We don't know what skill players are going to be highlighted in that back line. We already know the volatility that back three winger position has in the fantasy world, at least under the rules that we played under in the 2022 year. A little bit more confidence in the fly half position just with the amount of times that they touch the ball during an 80-minute span over a match. So I do agree, and like the order in which you did mention these in relation to the importance that they will probably have in future fantasy rugby seasons. Again, going to be dictated by the types of stat categories that we're hoping to add to this year. But yeah, definitely interesting signings for a whole bunch of teams. There being Nola Gold with the signing of Rodney Iona, also with Utah Warriors, like we just mentioned, adding Joel Hodgson, and then Matt mentioned the Arrows making moves, adding Cole Davis, Micaiah Torrance-Reid, and also the winger from Australia, Fabian Goodall. So and not to interesting.
Yeah, not to spend too much time in the notes, but I mean, look out. I would say everybody out there, look out for the Arrows. They are at least publicly making moves to put a serious effort towards developing young Canadian talent overseas. Yeah, I just want to throw that in there. Look out for that. It seems like the Arrows are the only ones that are really making it public. So yeah, I'm not sure what other teams are doing, but they've already sent guys overseas to develop in the off season. I mean, it's can do no harm by doing that.
Sure. And that's the last piece of news that I want to mention before we move on here to our highly anticipated Ask TFR show question every single week. But yeah, the Toronto Arrows adding another pro development partnership to their roster. Matt talks about sending guys overseas and getting the experience for their players. They have partnered with Scottish side Melrose RFC. O'Neill and Richardson, both players for the Arrows, are already in Scotland until the MLR preseason. And there are potentially more players that could be sent overseas to play with Melrose RFC and build that experience. Yeah, just to emphasize your point, Matt, this is just another great move by the Arrows. In addition to that Hong Kong partnership that we announced last episode, this is just an addition to that to really strengthen their ties to rugby competitions across the world and help their players develop at least on a professional level.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that wraps up news and notes. Nothing else, guys, that you guys have mentioned. Nothing on your chest. Unfortunately, guys, no Adam Gilchrist news this week. So still at the same portion or update, at least, that we were in episode 35. Again, going to keep you guys updated with the whole situation.
Yeah, my sources are pretty dry, too.
Same question, people. Where's Mr. Gilchrist? Somebody find him.
Mr.
I know where he is.
It's like the game. It's like, I don't know if you guys, where in the world is Carmen Sandiego? It's like, where in the world is where is Adam Gilchrist? There's gotta be some clues or something. We gotta find him.
But I gotta pay more money for that.
Yeah, all right. Let's move on here, guys, to the Ask TFR show question for this week. And I thought it'd be apropos to kind of link the couple fantasy worlds here that are clashing at this current time in the sports world. We got fantasy football in full swing. And obviously, I know. And obviously, you know, fantasy football is the epitome of what is fantasy sports, probably the most popular fantasy sport out there when it comes to kind of, you know, making an example or trying to emulate something. Fantasy football is kind of the pinnacle of that. I spoke with Vandy a little bit about before the show about that and how, you know, that's where we want to bring fantasy rugby. We want to bring it to that same popularity level. We want to bring it to that same excitement level. We want to help drive that. And by looking at fantasy football as kind of that model, we can learn a lot from. So that leads us to the Ask TFR show question to kind of keep things relevant and keep things kind of fresh here with the start of the fantasy football season, but we're going to have a little bit of a fantasy rugby spin. With the start of fantasy football, and now that you guys have experienced your week one horrors and your week one misery, your week one happiness, if you guys won in that first week, what is the biggest thing that's missing in fantasy rugby based off your experience from this last inaugural season that is separating the most between fantasy football and fantasy rugby? What is the thing that fantasy MLR needs to add to kind of shorten that gap the most between the two fantasy sport worlds?
I would say this is, I would say a little soon for kind of for rugby, but how integrated fantasy is with football. The analysts talk about it. If you turn on football, you can't avoid hearing about fantasy football. You can't. All the people talk about it. It's during the game. The announcers even making jokes. Players tweet out. It's so integrated into the game. They basically go hand in hand. And obviously, it's too soon for the MLR for that. But I would say that would be a major piece missing, is how just interlocked it is with the sport.
MLR, we are right here.
Yeah,
we are right here. Literally, you can email Email Ryan.
What year are
You
we
can send him a fax.
Yeah.
All right. You can send him a letter in 2 to 3 business days. He will get it and he will get back to you.
I'll even pay for the postage.
Yes,
right.
he will pay for the stamp. He'll even make it a cool one that changes vision when you turn the thing. All right. Yeah, Vandy. Yeah.
I was spit took that. I'm like, yeah.
But it is funny that you mentioned that though, Vanny, because the MLR obviously made steps towards trying to do something similar to that. For those of you that were paying attention to any of the broadcasts that were on the Rugby Network, wasn't a fantasy a perspective on it, but they did have, you know, trivia and like a kind of a betting-esque thing integrated into the broadcast on the Rugby Network. And they were giving out prizes and things like that. So yeah, just something like that. But now throw a fantasy rugby spin to that. Hey, MLR, come reach out to us. We can give you the fantasy rugby look.
Hey, MLR, Fantasy Ruckers. Boom. Look like a map. All the way around. That's perfect.
That's tight. That's tight. That's tight. Vandy, that's tight.
And again, and that just emphasizes the fact how, you know, the growth of fantasy rugby and the growth of the MLR goes hand in hand, right? You know, people getting into rugby by playing fantasy rugby is just going to, you know, increase the amount of people that are watching the MLR and vice versa. Hey, I never heard of this fantasy rugby thing, and it goes back the other way too. So yeah, great point there, Vandy. Matt, what about you, man?
You know, well, just to add on, do you know how many more players I know now that I'm playing fantasy rugby? I mean, the fact that these players are getting, you know, like there's so many more guys in the MLR that
I knew zero, so
exactly. So you're like,
and I know like 50. So
now you know all of them. So I mean, it's just it's great for the game. Vandy's totally right. I mean, once it gets to an integrated point, and you know, maybe Stacey Pates will mention us one of these days on the broadcast. You know, you can do it if you want, Stacey.
But yeah, Matt, before that brings up something in my head. Before you go there, it's true. It is actually crazy. Vandy never watched the MLR before last season, and now he's rattling off names off the top of his head left and right. And it is funny because that's the day and age that we are in with sports. It's not necessarily the whole, you know, team aspect about it. I think there's something to be said about the individualization of these athletes and them, you know, marketing the athletes as superstars and their own people. You know what I mean? Right. Fantasy rugby really helps that. And it's going to help grow these guys in the MLR as not only just team names, but just, you know, individual names are going to become notable too, which can only help grow the sport as well and help the MLR market it. But yeah, Matt, why don't you go here? What is the biggest thing that's missing from fantasy rugby right now?
Look, and this is coming off the weekend of fantasy football, and you know, my own most unhealthiest habit is watching a nice game, you know, relaxing, and then going to the app and going refresh. Where's my points? Give me my points. And yeah, you know what? As unhealthy as that is, I think once we can get there, once fantasy rugby can get to that point, and I mean, not just fantasy rugby, but our fantasy rugby league can get to that point, have that type of interface, have those stats available in live time from the MLR. All of those things come together. I can continue my unhealthy ways and I can start refreshing all year round. You know, when it's not football season, it's rugby season. I'm refreshing that app too.
But it's always refreshing.
Yeah, now instead of just refreshing from August to January now for football, now you get a refresh from August to August. Now you got to refresh all year long now, 365.
But hey, it adds it as unhealthy and as dumb as it sounds. It adds a whole other element to see how you're doing in fantasy and seeing these stats live and seeing those points get put up.
I gotta say though, there was a little bit of fun with you going off and you're like, wait, what is that? Was that 6.7? What did I get there? How far was that try? You go, damn, I gotta wait. Yeah. And then you're watching, and then you see somebody else go off and it's there, you know, they got that guy, and you're like, damn, we're even now.
Just to add on to that unhealthy aspect, Matt, I'm pretty sure I got to pull the clip up, but I'm pretty sure Vandy at some point last season said, you know, it is kind of nice not having the ability to refresh every single second to double check.
You know, it was my refresh, Vandy. I was texting Ryan last season during the game. Hey, you get that. It was a 15-meter try. That was a 15. That was 17 meters. That was 17 meters, Kamish. Come on.
Ryan hits back. It was 16, Matt. You're like, come on, dog.
Exactly. No, ain't no persuasion happening with the commish over here. But yeah, no, great point, Matt. Having that instantaneous kind of aspect,
instant gratification.
Instant gratification. No, it is exactly that. It is the instant gratification of watching one of your guys score a try. Exactly. So definitely something that we want to add. I think, yeah, definitely. One of the biggest things about fantasy sports is to have that kind of instantaneous feature of popping it up. But for me, and I don't know if this is kind of a cop out here, but I'm going to spin things around. I don't think that the fun of fantasy rugby is too far off from fantasy football. Yes, I do think the framework and the structure and all that stuff, the stats, the instantaneous aspect of it, and all that type of stuff. But I want to say, hey, I do like the fact that fantasy rugby has a more diverse positional lineup, if that makes sense. It adds a little bit more strategy to the game, and I'll relate it a little bit to fantasy baseball. I know you guys don't really play fantasy baseball, but I currently in the heat of a fantasy baseball playoff race right now, and there is a little bit of strategy behind having an increased number of positions that you have to worry about. You know, in football, it's just, you know, quarterback, running back, wide receiver, tight end. You know, you get those spots filled and you just worry about them. A large portion of that is just the running back and wide receiver, and you're just filling up on those spots. Where in fantasy rugby, you got to have a backup for your front row or decide not to go with one. You need a back row guy. You need a guy that's a fly half. You know, there's just that many more positions that you need to worry about. And I think that just adds a whole nother layer to the strategy of fantasy rugby that I think may supersede the way that fantasy football operates. But hey, I don't know if that's biased from the guy that is the creator of fantasy rugby. But yeah, Vandy,
you're onto something there when you like. Think about, there were a couple times last year where guys would be like, you know what, I'm just not going to play a second row this week.
Right.
You know, and then when you integrate tackles now that's it's pretty much a foolish mistake. Before it was like second row didn't get you many tries anyway. So, you know, you can see the idea behind it, but now it's like, shit, now I got to drop that bench guy because sitting 3 points off tackles doesn't make any sense.
Exactly. Yeah. No, I just think there's a whole lot more to think about when you got, you know, a whole different, you know,
who
profile.
The heck wasn't playing a second row. I needed every point that I could get.
I know, me too.
Who was out there not playing a position?
There were times I see like, anyways.
But yeah, there are certain player profiles that you got to think about. You know, what does the second row give you? What does the front row give you? What does the back row give you? And you kind of weigh those options and you weigh those benefits and you kind of formulate your lineup through that. And I think it does make Sundays a little bit trickier when it comes to the world of fantasy rugby and setting that starting lineup and the decisions that you have to make. So just the thought, a little bit of a plug going the opposite way that I think a leg up that fantasy rugby has over fantasy football. I had to balance things out there. So that's our Ask TFR show question of the week. Remember, if you have a question for us, make sure you submit it on social media using the hashtag Ask TFR show. You got a question about fantasy rugby, or send us a letter. And I'll pay for postage, apparently. So there's that. But yeah, let us know if you have a question about fantasy rugby, how it works, how you can join, anything really. Shoot us a message, shoot us a tweet or whatever on social media, and we'll try to include it in future episodes. So with that being said, let's move on here, boys. You asked for meters gained, so it's time to hop into meters gained. But I do want to kind of start this whole in-depth fantasy stats deep dive by a little bit of a recap of what we went over in episode 35 when it came to breaking down the tackle stats and talking about the impact that adding tackling would have on fantasy rugby. And last episode, we talked about the point value of the tackle system, and we went into the episode assuming that, hey, maybe 0.5 would be a good number. Got a little bit of pushback. Even got Matthew to change his answer there. Vandy had some good points there. Reached out to our fantasy league members as well and said, hey, what do you guys think about the value that tackle should be? One of our league members came back to us, Steven, a weekly viewer, so we really appreciate all of his support. So we had to give him a shout out here. And he says, hey, maybe we should even drop it to 0.25. So even being a little bit more conservative than what Vandy was thinking. Yeah, when you were mentioning 0.3. Yeah. So yeah, pretty interesting stuff. So what I want to give to you guys here as we kick off this this fantasy stats deep dive is give you the top 10 tackle stats with us changing it to 0.25. 0.5. And I'm going to give you as a little refresher what the top 10 tackle stats were from last week when we had it at 0.5. So at the top 10 here, we had Reichard Hadding, AJ Alatimu, Slade McDowell, Ed Fidow, Corey Daniel, Brendan O'Connor, William Tailetana, Bodine Waka, Leroux Milan, and Michael Smith. So those were our top 10 with tackles ranked at half a point.
What was 1 for points and what was 10 for points?
What was
like
what?
Overall points. Like what was Michael Smith and what was
Mike Smith, Dr. Smith was
Dr. Smith. No, overall, but what was his points on the year at 0.5?
Okay, I see what you're saying. So his overall his overall point line with tackles valued at 0.5 was 138.7. So that's with tackles at 0.5.
And what was Reichard Hadding?
And Reichard Hadding, I was just going to say 171.4 total points. Okay. And again, this is with tackles ranked at half a point. Now, let's get into the top 10 with tackles ranked at 0.25. And I just want to make sure that I have the right statistical sheet on here. I do. And the top 10 is with 0.25 tackles. Ed Fidow at number 1. Bodine Waka at number 2. AJ Alatimu at 3. Reichard Hadding at 4. Joe Peterson at 5, William Tailetana at 6, Slade McDowell at 7, Sam Malcolm at 8, Leroux Milan at 9, and Dean Muir at 10.
Dean Muir.
So we are definitely getting a less of a share in there of our forward pack. For those of you who are interested in that top 10 with 0.25 tackle points, we got 2 back 3 players, 3 fly halves, 2 back rows, and 2 centers. So a pretty even mix. Where I compare it over to 0.5 tackles, we had a heavy. We had, I think, 3 back rows, 2 fly halves, 1 back 3, and 2 centers, I believe. 4 back rows. So definitely a heavier proportion of back row players. And then, Vandy, to your point about what you were doing with the comparison, we said that Reichard Hadding 171.4 total points with 0.5 tackles. With 0.25, he was ranked at 121.15. So you're essentially going from 121 from 171. So you're basically, you're cutting it.
I'm back on the 0.5.
But you know what I did like to hear? The big names in the league were big names in the league.
Sure.
And Fidow was back up there. Bodine Waka.
Yeah.
Joe Peterson.
Yeah. Fair enough. I mean, I wasn't happy to see old Dr. Smith out of the top 10, but that's just my bias.
I rocked him all year last year.
But this is, I think, and a segue towards our what we're moving on to next.
I think we're closer.
Hey,
I'd like to hear
if we go 0.5, right? We go 0.5. You look at that balance. The forwards aren't going to get as many meters gained, right? They're not going to get as many meters gained. So suddenly, this meters gained is now balancing it out. And Fidow, we know is going to end up back at the top if we're adding meters gained. Yeah, I mean, that guy ran a track meet every time. So, I mean, that's the thing that we're going to have to look at the end of the day is say, hey, if we put tackles at 0.5, does adding carry meters at 0.1, does that completely balance it out? And now we're back to that steady balance of, hey, there's 5 forwards, 5 backs in the top 10. Boom. We're
and that's a great point, Matt, because I think right now it's really easy to say, because as we go through these stats, we are looking at each category through, a microscope, and we're using each one in an isolated situation. And we're going to break it down this later. Exactly. In a vacuum. Wow. That's exactly
what you scientist,
Physics.
We'll talk about this later on in this episode, but we're going to start looking at the different effects that each of these categories has on the makeup and buildup and landscape of fantasy rugby in the MLR. And I think as we start to go through this conversation and as we start to break down these specific categorical stats, we'll see, hey, if we add this category, this is the impact that's going to have. Okay, we need to counteract it with this. So kind of to Matthew's point, we have the tackles, but we got to balance it out with the meters gained, things like that. So when we start to kind of add these things together, I think we're going to start to try and get a a closer shot at making this balance kind of as perfect as possible to reflect, you know, actual fantasy or actual rugby performance on the field as accurately as we can through fantasy rugby points. So definitely going to be interesting. But yeah, I thought that was something that I needed to bring up. We talked about it last episode. If you missed our breakdown of the tackles, a thing that we've been waiting for so long to add to our fantasy season. So if you missed that episode that was episode 35 last week, you'll want to take a look at that. Really good conversation into how adding our first essentially defensive category stat can impact the fantasy landscape, and now kind of tweaking the point value. It's interesting to see how that makeup of the top 10, which is kind of a reflection of the makeup of that point as a whole has. And I do like to say, Vandy, to your point, I like seeing that we're starting to bring some of those marquee names back into that top 10. And hey, Matt, guys like Michael Smith are not too far off from the top 10 that we're talking about. Michael Smith is, I believe, if I look at the sheet, he definitely will be. Not yet. He will be soon. He's sitting at 31st. So not too far off. A guy that really didn't have much impact from a try scoring perspective and run carry meters really solely through that. And hey, you can kind of take that for as you will. But just the marquee, just one of those names that it was solely just, you know, tackling was his kind of strong
It will
suit.
be interesting to see the butterfly effect when we do add these. You know, I never really thought about too much of how much it'll shake up that.
Yeah, but it'll be interesting, and we're going to get into that. It'll be interesting. So let's break it down. Let's start talking about it. We talked about tackles last week. We recapped that. It's time to move on to the meters gained stat, which I think is an incredible stat for us to add. I would say probably the second most important stat after tackles that we've been wanting to add, because for those of you who are following along in our Fantasy Ruckers League, to make our league the most, I guess, user-friendly in the way that we're statting these games out, we couldn't just use a general meters gained stat. We had to only use the meters that were gained during a try scoring opportunity or a try scoring play. And that really limited us, and that limited a lot of the players and the amount of points that they had. You're talking about guys like Roberts-Tanana, who was a monster at gaining meters and really didn't have any fantasy points to show for it either. So this is what we're going to start trying to implement. It is going to be interesting to see what positions.
You knew he didn't have any fantasy points. You were watching the whole season.
Take that back.
You were watching the whole season on your team, sit on your bench doing nothing.
Hey, you know what? I still love.
Let's get to the meters
love my
gain.
players.
But yeah, let's get to the meters gain here, guys. The way we're gonna do this, I'm gonna break it down into our top 10 players at each position, and we'll see how that shakes up with the meters gain stat added. I thought it made pretty sense, and you can let me know how you guys think of this. I thought that because we used our try scoring meters gained as 0.1 per meter, I thought it was only fitting enough to continue with that 0.1 stat. For people who play fantasy football, yards are usually tallied by 0.1. I thought that was a good kind of baseline to go off of. And again, none of this is set in stone. Part of this whole experiment, part of this whole mind process is to figure out what value is actually going to work. But I think 0.1 is a good landmark to start with as we move forward. That makes sense to you guys?
Yeah. That checks out.
Oh yeah.
That checks out. All right. Sure. I'm glad you guys agree. I'm glad we're off to a good footing here. But
why did I point two?
All right, let's start off with the front row position and talk about who were our top 10 players from the front row. Top 10 guys, and I'll hop right into it. Dean Muir, Marco Jan van Rensburg, Lolani Faleva, Hugh Roach, Peter Malcolm. Those are your top 5 front row players.
We don't have to go into 10. I don't think there's much after that.
Yeah, we don't have to 10. I mean, I will say Andrew Quatrin was at number 7 there, so a nice little honorable mention. But we're talking about guys. Dean Muir racked up 446 meters gained, 525 for Marco Jan van Rensburg, 608 for Lolani Faleva, Hugh Roach 409, Peter Malcolm 433. These are guys that are able to get.
Hugh Roach would have more.
I'll be interested to know. Oh yeah, same Bandy. I agree.
How does he not have more? Hey, I feel like I see the guy all the time. But
Commissioner, quick thing for you to think about is a maul. If the guy has the ball at the back of the maul, is that?
I was just about to ask this.
Is that meters gained if they are moving past, or is that set piece meters gained?
I don't know.
See, these are the things that you got to make decisions on, Commish. There's so many things you got to think about, but hey, if
Matt knew he had you there too.
Yeah, I know. And to be honest, I'm not too sure how this meters gained stat is divvied up. I believe I want to say that that's included in this meters gained.
But hey, that's just because front row meters gain is probably going to be low, which we expect, which is fair. It should be that way. But you know, are they going to be rewarded for being the guy at the back of a strong maul? Are they going to be rewarded? Should the team set piece be rewarded? Who knows? I don't know. That's why I'm asking the question. Just wanted to throw it out there.
And just to put things into perspective, the front row position on average, I took all the players that appeared in at least one match at the front row position. On average, the total carry meters for the entire season was around 190 meters. So we're talking about guys that were doubling that in the top 5 there. Dean Muir, Marco-Jan von Rensburg, Lolani Faleva, Hugh Roach, Peter Malcolm, all above the 400 meter mark for the season. So obviously that's way above that 190 meter threshold. So obviously definitely making big impact on their fantasy ranking when it comes to that meters gained stat. Fun tidbit here, the player that led the league at the front row position at meters gained, Andrew Quattrin, 627 meters total on the season. So and he was, like I mentioned, at that 7th spot. So he'll be adding some of those meters to the New England Free Jacks in the upcoming year. Let's move on. I think the front row position is kind of one that we expected. Not many meters. They're not going to be benefiting much from it. They don't, handle the ball much, and when it does, it's in close quarters and really tight to the breakdown. Not a lot of gain. Yep. I think something that is going to be very interesting is the second row position, because these are some guys that have line breaking ability. This is guys that can really make an impact when it comes to those ball carry meter stats. Top 5 guys when it comes to ball carry meters are Johan Mumsen, Luke White, Ben Mitchell, Yuri Van Vuren, Dave Dennis.
You just named the whole team.
Those are your top 5 guys, and I believe Johan Mumsen was the guy that led all second row players with 724 total meters gained on the season. I believe that was at least 140 higher than the next guy, which is Dave Dennis with 599. So talk about the advantage that you have by having a guy like Johan Mumsen on your team if meters gained were a part of fantasy rugby.
Yeah, I mean, don't mess with Johan.
How many more meters, did he have?
He had 724 total on the season. The next highest guy was Dave Dennis, who had 599.
Holy, so like 150 would be, what would that be, 15 points?
Oh, yeah, 15 points. It's 15 points more.
And I want to say
over the year, that's a pretty good distribution.
Yeah.
Over the year, he's gotten 15 more points by running that more. That's not like a crazy mind-blowing number. Like that's what he earned by running more. Like I think
don't mess.
I'm thinking point one's smelling good so far.
Hey, Vanny, don't mess with Johan. You know what I mean? Don't mess with
passing
Johan.
The litmus test. That's all that matters.
And I mean, to be fair, there was, I think, a game where he did play at the back row position, so he's kind of that versatile guy. But yeah, talk about the advantage, like I mentioned, like you have with having a guy like Johan Mumsen at that second row position, especially if you have the ball carry meter stat in there. Very, very interesting. So yeah, if you can add, I think the conversation here is if you can just add guys like points that the second row position can get, because obviously there's no specialty that they have. They're not really involved on try scoring when it comes to set piece, so you're just looking for guys that can run with the ball, and it's just something to add when you're evaluating guys to put at your second row position. So interesting enough. I think one that we're going to have a lot of fun talking about is the back row position, because I think this is where you're going to start having a lot of ball carry meters. These are guys that are picking it off the back of scrums, back of breakdowns, have that line breaking ability even more so than the second row position, obviously. And our top 5 guys here for back row: Reichert Hadding, Ronan Foley, Lance Williams, Tavita Taimalau, and Devin Short. So those are the top 5 guys there for their back row position. Any surprising names there?
No, honestly, that you literally named 5 names that I probably
expected my boy at number 1.
And just to add there, 3 of those top 5 guys broke the 1,000 meters total gained on the season. So obviously,
Whoa, that is such
Lance,
a huge
Lance
step
Williams
up.
actually got 842.
No!
So if we do a comparison here, the second row position, I mentioned earlier that the front row position was averaging around 190 meters on the season. The second row position bumping it up a little closer to 270 meters. But then, yeah, Matt, like you mentioned, bumping it way up for back rows, jumping up to 320 meters on average. So, yeah, a lot more carry meters happening from the back row position. Good thing, bad thing, back row is already a position that, you know, you added the tackles. We saw them get boosted even more.
Yep.
So then you're adding ball carry meters, and that's going to boost them even more. Are we starting to see a product here where we're going to start seeing overpowered back row players?
I mean, look, I mean, we're comparing them to front row and second row. Yeah, of course they're going to look boosted, but once you compare them to back three, once you compare them to centers, it'll be just fine. I mean, back three is going to just run ball carry meters, right?
Yeah.
So back row is going to be that kind of middle ground, gets tackles, gets ball carry meters. But at the end of the day, I think we'll still see a nice little balance here.
And most people ran like, you know, your flex was a back row anyways.
Your forward flex?
Yeah, your forward flex was always. So you pretty much ran 2 back rows anyways. I don't think that changes. I don't think adding hits and running really changes that forward pack at all. It just adds more value to the forward pack.
Sure. All right, moving on to the scrum half position. This is where I think we're going to start seeing some discrepancies, especially, positionally. When we think of the scrum half position and even the fly half position, not often a guy that is finding, space and in open space and having those opportunities to get ball carry meters, more of the distributor, moving the ball around. So you might not see as high numbers here, but top 5 guys here: Danny Tusitala, Harrison Goddard, Jason Higgins. I think Jason Higgins, all those ball carry meters came from that one game where he scored 3 tries towards the end there. JP Smith and Damian Stevens. And I believe Damian Stevens had a couple games there where he blew off for some long tries. The scrum half that had the most ball carry meters on the season, Danny Tusitala, 571 total meters. He just re-signed a multi-year deal with Orglory DC. So hey, maybe he's a guy that will be an advantage if you do have meters gained in the league. But yeah.
Where's my boy Yogurt sitting?
Yeah. Oh, he's up there.
Let's see. Holden Younger. Holden Younger is sitting at not even
how many meters? You know how many meters it takes to get from the dressing room to the bench, Randy? That's at least 10 per game, man.
Well, he is ranked 27th, and he had 40 total ball carry meters. So I guess 40 meters is how long it's from the bench to the field, or vice versa.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, that was that. And sorry, I forgot to mention the back row that had the most carry meters or ball carry meters was Reichert Hadding with 1,091.
Yeah,
so obviously not surprising there.
Sense.
But yeah, scrum half position, again, this is a position that's averaging around 151 total ball carry meters, so even less than what a front row averages. So I really don't think you're really looking for a scrum half to tally this stat category. Yep.
I correct me if I'm wrong, but wasn't Goddard at the top of the tackle one too?
Let me pull that up for you.
I'm just thinking that you find these guys like Tusitala is honestly one of the rare, and I think that he's going to attack at some point in the game. He's going to find his chance, and he's going to break the line. Guys like Ross Brody, also a guy that will break the line from the scrum half position. I think once you find the scrum half that, maybe he's not getting assists, maybe he's not getting tries, but a scrum half that can both strong defensively and can make the ball carry meters, that's a really good find at that position, because as we know, it's pretty shallow. Yeah. Especially when you're seeing guys like, Higgins, like somebody who didn't even start most of the year. Guys like Higgins who are topping that chart there and getting into the top 5. The scrum half position is obviously, I think Vandy found out pretty quickly, pretty shallow position.
Heard that.
Yeah. It was actually JP Smith who led the league in tackles, 152, but Harrison Goddard was right up there at third highest scrum half with 119 tackles. So
I mean, these guys in the top 5 of both, don't even need them to take to be dishing out assists. carry meters and tackles. That's all you
right.
need.
And I mean, to be fair, that's what I'm talking about when it comes to these player profiles that you're now going to start. You're going to now start to build, right? As we start to figure out what categories will be added into our next fantasy rugby league, you're going to shape what a good fantasy 9 is to you. So if we do have meters gained, if we do have tackles, hey, maybe the perfect player becomes JP Smith, who is a guy that fills out the column for tackles and he attacks with the ball as well. A guy like Harrison Goddard tackles and he attacks with the ball as well. If you don't have meters gained and you don't have tackles, that completely changes the player profile that you're creating, right? You want a guy that has high try scoring ability, things like that. So based on these stats is how you're going to kind of shape what is the optimal 9 or whatever position you're looking at.
Did Andy Ellis finish top 5 when it was scoring for 9?
Andy Ellis, when it was our last year scoring.
I mean, he was top 5 in tackling, was he not?
Andy Ellis for tackling.
I remember him being top 5 in tackling.
All right, Andy Ellis for tackling was top 5. He was actually 5th with 106 tackles. And let me just pull up here. Hold on.
Yeah, while you're pulling this up, I actually think, Vanny, this completely at the 9 position, one that I think was particularly shallow.
Very tough.
I think what this does though is provide a lot more options, a lot more ability to take chance on guys.
You know what 9 will be like now? Like a kicker in football, where you're just trying to just hit a week. You know what I mean? You might not get a guy that's going to run you the year. You're just trying to hit a couple weeks in a row or something.
Yeah,
you know,
Andy Ellis get like 2 or 3 points.
Andy Ellis finished 12th on the year. And only had about 19.7 total fantasy points from our scoring last year. So really didn't have that much, try scoring ability. A guy that was top 5 in tackles, a guy that I'm looking here for meters gained, is sitting at the 10 spot, I believe, 11th with total meters gained. So
that's my bad. I thought he was top 5 scoring, and that's why I brought him up. I was like, this will help even out 9s that aren't like Andy Ellis, that were so involved in the scoring game, and now they're just hitters and runners, but I was mistaken.
But yes, to Matt's point, you're definitely widening the breadth of 9s that are fantasy relevant and guys that, like Vandy, you're saying, just not shots in the dark on any given week. You're now actually having some strategy a part of it by saying, hey, this is a guy that can, get me a confident 10 points because he's, really involved with the ball and running a lot and attacking a lot, versus a guy that, hey, maybe scores you a couple of tries during a week and explodes like a Jason Higgins last year in the 2022 season. So let's move on here, guys, to fly half now. Fly half, when it comes to meters game position, top 5. I mean, I feel like you can kind of guess who this top 5 is going to be. Bodine Waka, number 1. Caleb McEnany, number 2. AJ Alatimu, number 3. David Coates, number 4. And Sam Malcolm, number 5. The fly half with the most carry meters by far was Caleb McEnany. Caleb McEnany.
I knew it.
991 meters. Bodine Waka only had 647. A lot of that was, I think, the kicking and try scoring that Bodine had.
Yeah, you know what? I actually, now that I think about it, the fact that McEnany plays fullback, and he did play fullback in some games, that can definitely attribute to that. And having a fly half eligibility.
All over the field, though. When you watch him, he is everywhere. True.
Yeah, I don't remember that often Caleb McEnany really finding the try line.
No.
I think that point total is really being supplemented by the amount of times that he was attacking the line and breaking through and things like that. Because he was a big source of Utah's offense in terms of threatening the line and creating that space. I think Caleb McEnany was a big part of that. So surprising to see there. But again, fly half position, averaging about 292 carry meters on the season for fly halves that appeared. So you're slowly approaching the back row kind of number of meters. Fly halves touching the ball a lot. They're a part of those plays, attacking. They have a higher chance of breaking the line and having those big plays than a scrum half typically does. So not surprising to see them boost up a little bit.
I mean, talk about the balance, eh? Talk about the balance. I was just
about to say that. This seems like everybody's very relative with their running meters.
Yeah.
It seems like a lot of these positions aren't very far off.
And but the thing that I was thinking is that you think about if you split the forwards and backs up, right? Like 10, the fly off position, you don't expect them to get too many run meters, but their average is almost the same as the back row, which is the most run meters for the forwards. And this is exactly what I was alluding to earlier, right? Like the run meters are just going to be exponentially growing as you get closer to the back three for the backs. And that's what's just going to end up balancing out and be kind of the balancing act for the strength of the back row position.
Right. Well, let's talk about it because, yeah, you're exactly right, Matt. As you start getting closer to that back three, the carry meters surely are going up. And I think this is one that is going to be a big talker here between us about this impact, because it's a position that really didn't have much fantasy impact unless they were scoring a try. And that is the center position. But the center position, they know how to break the line, and when that does happen, a lot of meters come with it. And this is a position that is averaging the highest number of carry meters on average, and that is 550 meters on average for the season. That is 220 higher than the back row averages. That is higher than what I'm going to talk about here with the back three averages. So this is really giving a boost to the center position. Top 5 at the center position: Bill Meeks, LaRue Milan, Mark O'Keefe, JP Duplessis, and Faloasi Foatai are the 5 guys at your top 5. And the center with the most meters gained on the season is Bill Meeks with 1,552. And just to put a cherry on top before you guys break this down, 7, I believe, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 centers surpassed the 1,000 total meters gained on the season mark. So a lot of those 1,000 meters gained players are at this center position.
And hey, when you think about it as well, and just, I mean, we keep bringing it back to tackles, but it's that idea of balancing things out, right? Like, I think tackles and ball meters, like, I didn't expect, first of all, centers to be the highest. I thought back three would be the highest average, but there's more back three players. You know, sometimes some outliers can bring that average down. But centers, you know, not just ball carriers, those guys are also going to be reliant on making the hits, right? Those guys are going to be the ones that are making those tackles on maybe even, you know, the forward sometimes on the back. So yeah, I'm expecting once we bring it all together, the center position to honestly be you know, go from not that relevant to going to
important,
like, vital, right?
Yeah,
vital
important.
That you have a center like Billy Meeks and stuff like that.
Now, can you pull up Dominic Akina's run meters? So this is a guy that I had for a while, and I noticed he only really came in 60th, 70th minute. So I'd be interested to see, as a replacement center, how many yards a guy like that would get, and how important it is.
He came in at the back row too sometimes.
Yeah, but he only ever came in late in games. Like, he never played.
So Akina only tallied 351 carry meters on the season. Now, I only say only because in relative to the center position, that's a little bit further down. But yeah, he ended up finishing.
Accentuates how much you need a starting center on these ones that get you tons of meters. You're going to need starting back guys, starting centers.
Right. Well, that's where the conversation starts to shift, right, guys? Because I think by adding these stats that are accumulated throughout the entirety of an 80-minute match, you're no longer banking on a Dominic Akina maybe finding the try line in the 70th minute. You have an advantage of a guy who's playing 70 minutes, not only with that half-point bonus that you'll receive, but now this is 70 minutes that he's accumulating tackles, he's accumulating meters gained, stats that don't involve scoring plays or scoring opportunities. That is what you were banking on before with some of those guys that you were taking a shot in the dark with. So, yeah, definitely an interesting point there. And to wrap up the positions, guys, here, back three position here, and a guy that really benefited from the most and was at the top of the list and for our tackle list, and he's on the top of the list here in the back three: Ed Fidow, Renana Roberts-Tanana, Duncan Matthews, Joe Peterson, Penny Lasaka. Those are your top 5. And for the most carry meters,
I had 3 of those 5 at one point.
Yeah, whatever.
Wow. The most carry meters on the season was Duncan Matthews with 1,489. And to put things into perspective, as you guys break it down, the back three position averaged a total of 473 meters on the season. So just about under 100 lower than the center position.
But hey, what they're bringing lower than centers is what they bring in those 5-point tries. So
I was going to say, now, do they tackle a lot? Not.
I mean, from our, I think from our analysis last week was that the back three was a pretty,
it was hurt the most
low tap. But then that's what we talked about. Hey, the ball carry meters, that's where it balances out. Those tries, that's where it balances out. And hey, like what the back three lacks in tackling, the back three will gain in
and
the
this
try
will really
opportunities.
even them out with that tackling money.
Exactly.
You know? That'll really because you do want to to make it interesting. You do want to see your kind of big hitters get you big points. You know what I mean? It's just something about fantasy. If it's spectacular to watch on the screen, it should be spectacular in points on your phone. You know, it should relate like that.
Yeah. And that is what we're striving for. So interesting at the back three position. Wasn't really surprised of an Ed Fidel because we saw what he was doing last year. He was a top fantasy finisher for us because of the amount he scored. But a name like Renato Roberts Tanana, like we mentioned at the start of this breakdown, is a guy that would really benefit from this because it's a guy that didn't score that much. Only had he had 8 tries on the season, but he could have added so much more with that 1,351 total meters gained as well. That just would have skyrocketed him up the rankings there. Now it's time to reveal the top 10, guys. I'm gonna first reiterate the top 10 of our fantasy rules from last season. And that way that can kind of put things into perspective. So the top 10 fantasy players from the 2020 year with the high scoring output, again, Bodine Waka, Ed Fidel, Joe Peterson, AJ Alatimu, William Tailatana, Mitch Wilson, Reichard Hadding, Renana Roberts Tanana, Sam Malcolm, Rohan Saifaloy. And then when we added the meters gained, we are pushing Ed Fidel to number 1. Renana Roberts Tanana goes 2. Bill Meeks, LaRue Milan, Duncan Matthews, Joe Peterson, Bodine Waka, Marco Keefe, Penny Lasaka, Reichard Hadding. So we're pushing down guys like Bodine Waka. Reichard Hadding is moving down. Definitely not as high, guy that scored a lot of tries, but guys like LaRue Milan, Renana Roberts Tanana, Bill Meeks, guys that carry the ball a lot, got a lot of ball meters, really benefiting from that, skyrocketing them up into the top 10. What are you guys' thoughts on that?
I mean, interesting how many centers made it into that top 10. Eh?
Yeah.
Just they just pushed their way up in there, and I mean now I'm even more intrigued to understand. Okay, so this is ball carry meters. We get a very back heavy top 10. We go to tackles. We have the top 10 tackles at 0.5. We look at that top 10, very forward heavy. Brings the forwards up into that top 10. To me, it looks like the perfect match. And hey, the tackles are going to balance that out to bring some forwards in. The ball carry meters bring some centers and back three up to meet up with some of those top guys. And I mean, once we get to that point of announcing the multiple stats being added, I think it's just going to be like, all right, this is working.
Yeah. The only thing I kind of thought is, remember originally we were going to do what, 3, and how much was a kick going to be?
It was originally going to be 3 points for a penalty, 2 points for a conversion. We cut both of them into half of that.
Yeah, now I think it might be interesting to add that back to what we were originally going to when we stem back in running meters, because kicking is a big part of the game, and you don't want to kind of delete that. But I noticed a lot of those kickers that you just said almost were gone just based off of just running meters. Now what happens to centers and everything when you add the tackles?
Sure. Well, I mean, and to be fair, I mean, part of that is that the fly half position is probably the most frequent and most popular position that is taking those kicks.
100%.
They're also the position that is not having as many carry meters as, let's say, a back three, a center, a back row. So definitely those moving parts there. But moving on here too, and that's a great segue into this, Matt, is the actual impact that these stats are having on the fantasy rugby landscape. And the way we broke that down last week with the tackles is how much is this shifting the rankings? Where are these players now moving to relative to their to the other fantasy players? Where are they moving when we're adding these stat categories? So this is to reveal for you, and we'll get your reaction from it. When we added the total meters gained stat, the front row position on average dropped about 13 spots in the rankings. Not surprising. Front row position doesn't get that many meters. The second row position, the highest change that we have in the entirety of this meters gained experiment, going up 26 rankings. It's the highest shoot up that we'll have out of all the positions here. Pretty cool to see, because second row is a position that we're trying to highlight, trying to emphasize, trying to get more integrated into the fantasy world. So to see that the meters gained is something that could really do that is really an optimistic thing to see. The back row position, surprisingly, only 2.72 difference in the ranking. So really not having an impact on the ranking. So it's interesting to see that. A part of that could be because all the back rows are really moving relative to each other. There's definitely different underlying factors to that. The two biggest that got impacted by adding meters gained, the fly half position going down 50 spots, and then the scrum half position going down 70 spots. So you are really nerfing, or you're really, reducing the power or the impact that the scrum half and fly half position can have. The center position going up 10 rankings, so another positive there. And then the back three position actually going down 7 rankings, but again, not that much. I wouldn't really attribute that to a whole lot of a difference here, because it's around that zero output. And again, we also tracked scoring meters last year. Again, back three players are scoring most of the tries, so a lot of those meters gained could already have been baked in to our stats from the 2022 year. So seeing that second row position, center position really getting the boost, fly half, scrum half really getting the nerf there and really getting powered down. Overall thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not too surprised, honestly. I mean, the second row and center position were probably two positions that weren't that relevant because they weren't scoring tries. But now we can see that the two positions are fairly good at meters gain. Now the tries don't matter as much, right? Like now the tries are almost irrelevant for those two positions because they're able to make such an impact with ball carry. So I honestly think that that's good to see. And 100%. I think now it's understanding, hey, how can we elevate the rest of the positions at the same level? How can we get everybody to kind of, everybody to have their own balance? And
I think with those results, point one is, I think we're right on the money there. I think that is, kind of the rises and falls you'd want to see. Fly half, scrum half, obviously that was going to take the biggest hit. Makes the most sense. But
I mean, look, I mean, the other thing is that it's hard to value the impact of a scrum half and a fly half in real life. Like, I think it's hard to see the impact of a fly half and a scrum half on paper. You're not going to be able to track that. And I think that the fact that we don't like the fact that they aren't getting, maybe they end up being some of the lower scoring positions outside of kicking. I think that that's fair. I think that that makes sense. That transfers to real life, because in real life, you can't value that. There is no way that you can value their value to a team. Statistically, it's difficult. So I think that at the end of the day, like, hey, like you said, Vandy, maybe they're kind of like our kickers. The guys that are just kind of, or like they're just kind of scoring the regular consistent points, and that's what you expect.
All right. So to put a whole nice little bow here on what we have so far and what we've been breaking down in our off-season fantasy stats deep dive, we did tackles last week. We've now gone through meters gained this week. We now understand the positions that the meters gained benefits, really helping out the second row, helping out the center position, really taking a hit on the scrum half and fly half positions. And then to recap for the tackle stats, before we shifted it to 0.25, it was the front row, second row, back row all getting massive boosts. But I think we've come to an agreement, or at least a closer understanding, that maybe reducing that a little bit is going to help. With the 0.25 change, still boosting up the front row, really boosting up the second row, boosting up the back row, and all the back positions essentially taking a hit, the center position taking the least amount of a hit. So it looks like, in theory, guys, that if we were to implement these two things, I think we would solve our second row problem that we're having in the Fantasy Ruckers League. The only concern that I may have is that the scrum half and fly half position is really going to get reduced here, and may take a position that is already very scarce and already not deep, and is a hard time for fantasy managers, in at least our league, to really solidify a guy at that position. Maybe hard moving forward into next year with these two stats.
Yeah, I don't know if I agree. I mean, I think that Yeah, maybe you won't get the 10, 15-point games from the scrum half and fly half. I mean, more importantly, more specifically, the scrum half position. But I don't think that that's what you should be expecting. I think that despite it being lower, them being the lower scoring, it still increases the depth because now all of a sudden, last year we would have only 1 to 7. The top 7 scrum halves would be scoring points any given week. Now we got, 1 to 15 scrum halves in the league you have to choose from will at least put up, 1 point, at least put up 2 points, 3 points, 4 points. And that's what you should expect from them.
And I want to add this too, is that I think at the end of the day, right, obviously we're looking at the rankings, which is a relative kind of marker on how these players are doing, and they're all moving up together, right? We have to remember that we are all adding points to this. And I think that's what we want to see in fantasy. More stats, more things that we're tracking, more things that we can bake into that fantasy score that you're tallying up during your week is a good thing. We don't want to see the scores that we had last year that were like 9 to 8. We don't want to see those. We want to see things that are more like 50 to 40. We want to see high scoring weeks. And by adding meters gained, by adding tackles, we're getting that. So maybe a scrum half relative to other scrum halves or relative to other positions isn't being as impactful. But now instead of scoring just 2 points on a week, they're scoring 10 points, which is what we want to see as a whole when it comes to fantasy sports. Because we love counting numbers. We love points. When we see points, it's an instinctual thing for, I think, all fantasy
points.
Yeah, look, I need all the help.
Refresh. Points.
Yeah, refresh. And I need all the help I can get. So we got to add these points.
Exactly. And to basically wrap up this show, guys, I know you guys have been talking about it. You'd be interested. This is my best Matt and Devin impression. We'd be interested to see how these categories would look if we started integrating them together and we started putting them together and see how impact it would have. Well, your commissioner
doesn't even sound like you, Vandy.
your commissioner. Wait,
was that me or was that John Madden?
Where are you getting John Madden from?
Wait.
Sound like John Madden? No, I just did a generic Matt and Devin impression. That was my impression of you guys.
Madden.
No, Matt and
Madden.
Unfortunately, Madden can't.
Well, I was reading your guys' minds, and I have got your top 10 if we were to integrate both meters gained and tackles at the value that we send. I think this is a great way to end off the show. We're going to tell you right now. We're going to tell you right now. We're going to move on after that because we're going to have a future episode. Once we start breaking down each of these stats and I slowly continue to add them to this final ranking, we're going to see how this changes. And then once we decide on the categories that we want to include, we'll have an encompassing episode where we break down the rankings with those included stats. But just to tease to you guys on the track that we're going, here's the top 10 that we got so far with 0.25 as tackles and 0.1 as meters gained. You guys ready?
I thought you were going to leave us on a cliffhanger. I thought you were going to just say, hey,
I thought you were
next episode to find out the top 10.
No.
I was going to say, whoa.
I'm not that mean to them. I'm not that mean to the people.
I guess I'm tuning in next week.
I was going to say, I was about to watch our episode next week real quick, right after it came out.
All right. So here's the top 10 with both meters gained and tackles. Ed Fidow at 1. Laruma Lan at 2. Hugh Roach at 3. Reichert Hadding at 4, JP Duplessis at 5, Renata Roberts Tanana at 6, Faiawasi Fuatai at 7, Calvin Whitting at 8, Duncan Matthews at 9, and Joe Peterson at 10. Bo Dean Waka is not in our top 10.
Is that 0.5 or 0.25?
0.25.
See that?
When you think about it,
I think that exactly says why we
or hit a lot. He was just a scoring machine.
It's true. It's true. And you got assists.
This is something
and it's interesting. It is something to think about because and we'll end it off on this. The goal here, like we said, and we've been mentioning this over the past few in-depth stats episodes, is that the ultimate goal here is trying to reflect the best players on the rugby pitch are going to be the best players in our fantasy league. I think a large part of why Bodine Waka got selected as the MVP is not things that you can necessarily represent with a fantasy point. His decision-making ability, the impact that he has on the field when it comes to tight situations, his leadership on the field, things like that. Those are things that you cannot encapsulate in a Fantasy Ruckers league. So maybe him out of the top 10 is not necessarily a crazy thing. But that is something to think about going forward, is that our MVP moves out of the top 10 with the meters gained and tackle stats that we introduced.
I just want to do a quick little one. You know what it reminds me of? It reminds me of a couple of years ago. I hate to bring up another sport, but football. When LeGarrette Blount was on your Patriots. And LeGarrette Blount scored a touchdown a game. Yeah. And he scored the most touchdowns out of any player in the NFL. And he wasn't even in the top 20 players.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? He had no yards, no catches, no nothing. Scoring machine. Wasn't even top 20.
True. And I mean, it would be interesting to see how many, like in more established fantasy sports, you know, how many times does the fantasy MVP match with the actual NFL MVP? Because, I mean, last year, what was it? Aaron Rodgers? He definitely wasn't the fantasy MVP last year.
Ryan, were you imitating us or were you imitating yourself? Because you just said exactly word for word your imitation. It's interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see. What's going on?
All right. Okay.
No. What he does
is interesting to see.
Matt's getting lippy. All right,
I think that's a good note to end it on. We'll let Matt have the last word there. But, hey, this will be the ultimate teaser, guys. I gave you guys the top 10, and we'll continue to reshape that. But this is the teaser. Hey, guys, next week, stolen breakdowns are being added to the stats. That's where we're going. We're adding another defensive stat. So we'll see what guys. Maybe Lucas Rumble might be there. Maybe pushes a little bit up higher in the rankings. Some of the forwards we'll see.
Dr. Smith
should be Dr. Smith. Maybe should be interesting to see how breakdown steals are going to work. All right, you guys done? You guys are
let's get the show out of here. Let's get out of here.
For Matt Yee, for Devin Manny Vanderpool, I'm Ryan E. Tune in next week for another edition of the Fantasy Ruckers Show. Until then, be good, and we'll see you then.
At 45, sponsor us, please.
You've been listening to the Fantasy Ruckers Show, bringing fantasy rugby to the masses, covering everything rugby from the MLR and beyond. We hope you enjoyed the show. Make sure to like, rate, and review, and be sure to tell all your friends. We'll be back soon, but in the meantime, connect with us on social media at the Fantasy Ruckers. Till next time, this is the Fantasy Ruckers Show, signing off.